more now. Ammar Waqqaf joins us via Skype. He's the founder and director of Gnosos, an organization that consults on Syria and the Middle East. With us in the studio, Rasha Elass is a Syrian-American journalist. From Moscow, Alexey Khlebnikov is a Middle East expert with the Russian International Affairs Council. And joining us from his office in Washington, D.C., Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ammar Waqqaf, let's start with you. What do you know about the status of this battle for Idlib in Syria right now? What's going on there?
Well, we understand that the Syrian army and its allies are bombarding concentrations of militants in the Idlib area, in preparation for an advance or a ground troop advance onto their positions.
Russia, what do you know about the battle there, especially the status or the fate of civilians in the area?
Well, there are about 3 million civilians there, and many of them have already been displaced from other areas, evacuated from places like gov't, for example, which was the recipient of a chemical attack in 2013. Those people are sitting just waiting to see what happened, bracing themselves for the worst. They have very few choices as they see it. They don't want to leave Syria because they know they don't want to live as a refugee outside. They don't want to go back under the control of the Assad regime because they don't trust what will happen to them. And they're bracing themselves for the worst. They look at their families and they hope they will not die, but that is a very real option for them.
Now, Russia, as I mentioned, the presidents of Russia, Iran, and Turkey held a meeting in Tehran to discuss the situation in Syria. There is deep concern over the fate of those civilians in that area that you were talking about. Here's what the Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, had to say. Let's watch.
The issue of Idlib is one of the most sensitive and important topics in international public opinion. On one hand, a high number, some thousands of terrorists from al-Nusra Front and Islamic State group and other terrorist groups are present in Idlib, and they are acting against the security of the Syrian people. And with their terrorist acts, they continue their illegal and anti-human behavior. On the other hand, in order to destroy these terrorists, and because of the big number of population present in the region, precautions must be taken so that civilians are not hurt.
This sounds like it's going to be a decisive battle. What is your assessment of this battle and what it will do to the area?
It's definitely a decisive battle, especially in the mind of the Assad regime, and I'll tell you why. Once this battle is gone forward, and I won't say fought because it's an asymmetric battle and the Assad regime and his allies will win. But once that happens, the people who live there will be basically invited or pressured to return into to live under the Assad regime. And when this happens, this is when the rewriting of history will begin. And it's already starting in other parts of Syria, where the people who used to be under rebel control now live under regime control. They're being debriefed by the regime, and they're being pressured to change their testimonies about what went on during those years when they endured government bombardment, including chemical attacks. They are pressured to withdraw their testimony and to say this did not happen, we did not witness what we said that we had witnessed. And what we're witnessing right now, the world at large, is a very aggressive and sophisticated propaganda campaign to finish this uprising turned civil turned regional war,
right,
so to speak.
But what you're saying, you are basing on a belief that at some point President Assad and his government will be held accountable for what happened there.
It doesn't sound like they will be held accountable in any way, and they're working very hard at erasing the historic record.
Okay, let me bring in Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution. Michael, the United States and the United Kingdom have warned President Assad against using chemical weapons in this battle for Idlib. What role is the United States playing right now?
Well, the United States, as you know, has the primary goal of minimizing its involvement. That has been clear since the Obama days, and it remains the policy under President Trump. The second most important priority is the defeat of ISIS and also any al-Qaeda affiliate formerly known as the al-Nusra Front. Only after those two top priorities does the United States think hard about anything else, like limiting refugee flows or trying in the earlier years to achieve some kind of political transition, or trying to begin reconstruction in some of the autonomous areas, for example, the Kurdish North. Those goals are all well behind the top two goals, again, of keeping our role very limited and trying to defeat ISIS and al-Qaeda. What that means is we don't really have much leverage, and of course the United States has floundered throughout much of this campaign, trying to encourage revolt against Assad, but never quite delivering the kinds of capacities or capabilities that would be needed by the opposition to overthrow him. And in these last 2 to 3 years, not even really caring about that. So I'm afraid that we're at a bit of an impasse in terms of our ability to use much leverage here. I think there are some new policies we could consider, but we don't seem to really be serious about that.
So, Michael, when you say that the United States doesn't have much leverage, and the fact to some extent it has really ceded control and influence in that region to countries like Russia, does the United States not see any great strategic importance in getting involved in this battle?
The United States is certainly involved, is certainly worried about Iranian presence inside of Syria and its potential to therefore threaten Israel. I don't really think the United States feels like it's in some great game against Russia. Frankly, the relative importance of Syria for the United States is not that great, and this is not the Cold War all over again. There certainly aren't that many people in the Trump administration who seem to care that much in those terms. It's not to say that everybody admires Russia's role in this conflict, but I don't think there's some huge global geostrategic competition. The real concern here is Israel's security, the defeat of ISIS, and to the extent possible, minimizing the human tragedy of what's already happened, and trying to make sure that ISIS can't reemerge because conditions would be so poor for Sunni populations in a post-conflict environment. Those are the main American concerns. Personally, I would like to see us have a little bit greater concern for the well-being of the Syrian people, but it's pretty clear that that has not been a top U.S. priority throughout.
All right, let's get the view from Russia. Let's go to Moscow. Alexey, you've written that Russia's been involved in this battle for a long time on the side of President Assad, and you've written that Russia has proved that it can fight a battle outside its borders and to some extent win. But what's next for Russia? Now it faces the politics of the region, a humanitarian crisis, and as you've pointed out, this could be a bigger challenge for Russia.
Exactly. My entire phrase was, yes, Russia demonstrated it can win militarily in Syria, but whether it can manage to gain political success, that's a bigger question. And that's exactly what we can see now in Idlib. So this discussion between Russia and Turkey over the deal, which is currently under discussion between them, will define what will be the next steps and the flow of the conflict, because currently both Russia and Turkey, they are not interested in a large-scale offensive, and it seems that Moscow managed to convince Damascus also to postpone that until the deal with Ankara will be struck. In the first place, Russia's priority now in Syria is to return of the refugees, humanitarian aid, reconstruction, and launch of political process. So this is why a large-scale offensive counters Moscow's interests. And secondly, if that happens, that would alienate Turkey from Moscow. And without Ankara, Moscow won't be able to proceed with the political process given the leverage Turkey has over the opposition groups.
But what would Russia like to see come out of some kind of negotiated political process?
If we talk about Idlib, I would say that the ideal situation for Russia is that limited military operation, maybe a joint Russia, Syrian government forces and Turkish forces against Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS militants in Idlib, separation of them from the civilians, and ultimately getting Idlib under the Damascus control. If we talk about the larger long-term goal for Russia, it's definitely to launch political process form the constitutional committee under the Geneva process and to have this political transition. Because as you've mentioned rightly in the beginning, and I also argued that yes, Russia has already been proved that it has capacities to conduct military operations beyond its borders, but it's yet has to prove that it can reach political goals, which will be counter to U.S. Failures in the past in Iraq, in Libya. So this is why it's very important now for Russia to demonstrate success in political track.
Ammar Waqqaf, is the government of President Assad prepared to enter into some kind of negotiation, some political settlement here?
Well, with the rebel groups, we've seen before that the rebel groups, part of them, they disseminated, part of them wished to continue fighting forever, so they went out of the areas that the government regained control of, and others really laid down their weapons, and actually part of them became part of the Syrian army or joined the Syrian army and is now pursuing a career there. With the political opposition in Geneva, it doesn't seem likely that this is going to happen anywhere soon. These people do not really represent much of what is happening on the ground. Let's take Idlib, for example. Many of the people in Idlib, currently situated in Idlib, will have had enough of the militants already. They wish to go back to normality. Many of the people who are in Idlib at the moment never wanted to get out of the government control and under the extremist militants' control. Many in Syria have seen the absurdity of this war and want everything to happen, to end all this, a nightmare behind their backs and so on and so forth. So probably the government of President Bashar al-Assad feels that it is, once they regain control, and they've practiced this in many areas, in eastern Ghouta, in Dar'a, in Qalamoun area, North Hama, and all of those places didn't see much fighting, really. People just wanted to lay down their weapons. The government may think now that it's easier to negotiate with the locals, bring them back to normality, education, healthcare, so on and so forth, rather than to deal with politicians or quasi-politicians who are viewed very much in Damascus as proxies to the Saudis, to the Qataris, the Turks, and so on.
Rasha, how big a problem is that? If there is to be some kind of political settlement here, who does the government negotiate with?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a good question, but I think what ends up happening on the ground is the government goes in and, I'm going to put it in quotation marks, negotiates with the locals. But that's not a negotiation. It's it's very asymmetric. This is the regime and then the locals. And when you talk to people in Idlib, and many of them already evacuated from other parts of Syria, they tell you they've seen it over and over again. When the regime comes in, most people will just surrender because they want to be with the powerful party. And once they surrender, this is when anything can happen. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes when they do join the Syrian army, they also on average, get killed within a month because they're sent to the worst possible position on the front line. They are, after all, traitors. Many of them were former defectors. And, not to mention the very aggressive pressure to change the historic narrative.
Yeah, but whatever happens now, the Syrian government is going to be in a position to negotiate from a position of enormous strength given these battlefield events.
Yes, I think it's just going to go in and make its demands, and it's going to say one thing and do another, and with the aim to get away with what it got away with so far.
Michael O'Hanlon, there has been something of a response from the Trump administration. Well, that's what the Wall Street Journal tells us. It tells us that it quotes unnamed anonymous American officials as saying that President Assad has already given his troops permission to use chlorine gas in the battle for Idlib. What do you make of this report?
I think it's plausible, but I think the main United States options that we could imagine the Trump administration considering would include not only threatening retaliation against that, where I think their credibility is pretty high based on their previous actions, but also threatening to retaliate against any helicopters or airplanes conducting barrel bombing of apartment buildings or other indiscriminate uses of force. And that could be sort of a way to be tougher. You could also imagine greater flexibility. And basically the Trump administration saying, we're not going to help reconstruct any part of Syria that's run by President Assad, but we're also not going to support the Geneva process and the original goal of trying to somehow negotiate him out of power, because it's just not realistic. And we're going to have to essentially allow him to largely choose his own successor. Opposition groups and the international community could have some say in building a new cabinet for that successor, but that could be the more realistic political strategy. These are the kinds of ideas that I think are consistent with a still relatively limited American role, but I don't see the creativity and thinking that's happening right now to make me think those are very likely. So I would like to see those kinds of debates, but I'm afraid we're going to see probably just the threat to retaliate against chemical weapons use and to complain that some of these uses of force are indiscriminate and kill a lot of innocent people, but not really have leverage to back up those complaints and those threats, except very narrowly on the chemical weapons front.
Yeah, but do you not find it a little bit suspicious that this statement comes, it's basically telling us that President Assad is telegraphing his battlefield plans and intentions? Has he done that in the past?
Well, I don't know to what extent this is recent chatter that actually relates to the movement of actual munitions, and to what extent it is sort of analytical deduction based on previous patterns of behavior. It may be a little bit of both. None of this would surprise me, because Idlib is a big military challenge for the regime, even though, as was previously said by another guest on the show, even though Assad's going to win with Russia and Iranian help, in the sense that nobody can really stop him, he has an enormous difficulty of trying to root out these so-called terrorists, and some of them really are terrorists, amidst 3 million people. And so he probably wants to have every lever at his disposal, including the lever and the threat that will cause fear. The simple threat of causing fear by threatening chemical weapons use may get some people to lay down their arms, and that may be part of his plan.
Alexey, at that Tehran meeting, the Turkish leader pushed very hard for a ceasefire, but there was no agreement on that. And here's the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, on that particular issue. Let's watch.
There are no representatives of armed opposition here at our table. And moreover, there are no representatives of Nusra Front or ISIS and the Syrian army. It means, in my opinion, and I believe the Turkish president is right in general, it would be good. But we cannot speak for them. Moreover, we cannot say for Nusra Front terrorists or ISIS that they will stop shooting or they will stop using drones with bombs.
So, Alexey, here we have that problem again, and we heard it from President Putin. If there's going to be a ceasefire, who signs off on the rebel side for that ceasefire?
So exactly during the meeting, there was no one who was on the table from the side of rebels, of terrorists, which was, would be weird. But in general, the bottom line of Putin's message was that Russia's red line is safety of its military base and military personnel in Hmeimim base and in Latakia region. And during the recent months, exactly from Idlib province, it was targeted by drones and mortars from the territories held by terrorists. And actually, if to continue watching that episode which you just played, then Erdogan agreed that actually it is quite realistic to get rid of those destructive elements who resides in Idlib. So that's actually kind of a two-way road where Russia needs a security for its military base and uses this card, and Turkey needs ceasefire and minimize the refugee flow and minimize loss of the territories it controls in Syria north. So this is why the bargaining is still ongoing. And also I would like to remind everyone that Idlib is not the last outspot or the last card Erdogan can play. Let's not forget that Turkey also controls territories between Aleppo and the Turkish border, including cities of Jarablus, Azaz, Al-Bab, Afrin, where Syrian National Front, backed by Turkey, operates. And actually that's the territory held by Turkish-controlled forces. And that's the area, potential area for militants to leave Idlib.
Why is Syria so important for Russia, Alexey? I mean, as you pointed out a moment ago, it has troops there, it has military bases there. But why is this Middle Eastern country important for the Russians?
In the first place, as it's viewed by Moscow, it's from the security perspective that given the involvement of Russia-born militants or terrorists who joined ISIS from ex-Soviet space was about 5,000 people. Another important thing also connected to the security, Russia wants to prevent the collapse of existing state structures, institutions, to prevent the country from basically sliding into chaos as it happened with Iraq and with Libya. That's examples which Moscow constantly uses. And in fact, it managed, since its military deployment in 2015 in September, to reach those goals.
Right.
So we see now Syria more or less stabilized in terms of fighting against ISIS and controlling its own borders. And remaining issues, which I think are way more difficult, are to settle the issue with Kurds, with Turks, then with Americans, whose forces are on the south in Atanf area and in Kurdish-held areas, and of course its political process and Syria's reconstruction.
Ammar Waqqaf, what do you make of what you've just heard there, that Syria could slip into chaos like Iraq did or like Libya did if there is no foreign involvement?
Actually, it is the foreign involvement, or let's say malign foreign involvement, which could have probably prompted Syria to face a similar fate to Libya, Yemen, or Iraq. The government, what we have in Syria is that the government remained, the central government remained, which is a unique platform, given the examples everyone is talking about, is a unique platform that would enable the rebuilding of the country and the restoration of the country as a whole. Had it not been for Russia involving itself in the face of continuous Saudi, Turkish, Qatari, and then American and so on, arming and funding of the Islamic opposition, militants that is, then probably Syria would have gone that route. But let me tell you, the challenges are not, they're not ending anywhere soon. Yeah. We've seen in the Astana meeting a few days back that the Russia, Iran and Turkey, and from behind the scenes, I would argue Syria as well, are making plans for ahead to challenge or to confront challenges like, for example, what is happening in the eastern Syria and the American support of a separatist movement there.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. That's all we have time for. But the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.